Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are diving into a seriously fascinating theological debate. We're going to objectively map out how completely different theological frameworks read the exact same ancient texts. Specifically, we'll be looking at the biblical Unitarian critique of traditional Trinitarian arguments. Let's get right into it.
Okay, let's dive into this. The core tension we're exploring today basically comes down to this one big question. When we read about miraculous deeds, things like calming storms or forgiving sins, do those actions automatically prove that the person performing them has an innate divine essence? Or do they simply demonstrate divine permission and empowerment? It's a huge distinction.
Here's our roadmap for the explainer. We'll start by looking at the deity debate. Then we'll move into deeds and delegated power, followed by the seat and subordinate roles. After that, we'll reconstruct the landscape with the brand new gospel acronym and wrap up with the broader implications of agency.
Section 1. The Deity Debate Explained and Decoding the H.A.N.D.S acronym.
So, our source material today rigorously critiques a popular Trinitarian apologetics framework known as the H.A.N.D.S acronym. Now, H.A.N.D.S stands for Honors, Attributes, Names, Deeds, and Seat. It's a system widely used to argue for Jesus' deity. But for our focus today, we're zeroing in on just the last two letters, the deeds and the seat arguments. We want to understand exactly how biblical Unitarians interpret these very same biblical texts from a completely different angle.
Section 2. Deeds. Power by delegation, and the whole concept of bearers versus mediators. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the stark contrast between these two views. The traditional view argues that the sheer magnitude of Jesus' miracles implies he's a bearer of innate divine power. The logic is, he does what only God can do, therefore he literally must be God. But the Unitarian view? They read this as delegated agency. In this framework, Jesus is a mediator of power. So the deeds don't point to an innate divine nature, but rather that he was supremely authorized by God.
And the source material points out that there are actually really strong biblical precedents for this kind of delegated power. Think of it kind of like an ambassador, right? An envoy speaks for the king, with the king's full authority, without actually being the king. Look at Moses. He parts the Red Sea, but it's God's power. Elijah raises the dead. The apostles are explicitly given the authority to forgive sins. So biblical Unitarians posit that Jesus operates as God's ultimate uniquely authorized proxy. He's the greatest agent of all, sure, but an agent nonetheless.
This perspective heavily anchors itself in statements taken directly from the texts. Take John 5:19 as a prime example here. The sources note that Unitarians take this statement at face value. When Jesus says the Son can do nothing of himself, he is explicitly relying on the Father's delegated power and direction, rather than drawing on his own internal divine nature. It's all about acting in perfect, reliant unison with the Father.
Let's move to Section 3 and see how this builds into our next point. The seat, the subordinate right hand, and sitting on God's throne.
Okay, so the S in that H.A.N.D.S acronym argues that sitting on the eternal throne at God's right hand means Jesus must be fully divine. It implies co-equal rulership. But looking through the Unitarian lens, we see a totally different interpretation. They argue that, historically, being at the right hand definitely denotes a highly exalted position, absolutely, but an ultimately subordinate one. You are the right-hand man to the king. You aren't the king himself.
And this brilliantly illustrates that point. Look at the historical precedent right here in 1 Chronicles 29:23. We have a direct example of a human, Solomon, sitting on the throne of Yahweh. The throne represents God's rule, but the person governing as a proxy isn't considered God. The Unitarian critique basically argues that Jesus' seat in heaven functions on this exact same principle of deputized kingship.
The sources also look really closely at Daniel 7, which is a key text about the Son of Man. Notice the directional flow of authority here. The Son of Man is presented before the Ancient of Days, clearly a superior, and is given dominion and kingship. The Unitarian reading emphasizes that, well, if this figure were already fully divine, he wouldn't need to be brought before a superior to be handed an authority he already naturally possessed. Make sense?
All right, Section 4, Defining the Gospel Acronym, which is the Unitarian framework.
Now that we've seen how the sources deconstruct the H.A.N.D.S acronym, let's look at how they reconstruct their own view using a brand new, highly memorable acronym, Gospel. We'll kick things off with G, which stands for given life. The core argument here is that unlike the Father, who is entirely self-existent, Jesus' existence is completely contingent. Simply put, he was given life by God.
Next up, hit O for offered life.
The source material emphasizes that Jesus' genuine mortality is central to this theology. He was truly mortal, genuinely capable of dying, and offering his physical, human life is exactly what made his sacrifice for humanity so real and meaningful.
Then we have S for subordinate. This framework asserts that Jesus is not ontologically equal to God. The sources point to texts like 1 Corinthians 15, which suggest that even at the very end of all things, after the ultimate victory, the Son himself remains subjected to the Father so that God may be all in all. Moving right along to P, we have peccable. Now, that's a theological term meaning able to sin. The Unitarian position detailed in our sources argues that Jesus didn't have some divine cheat code, He faced genuine temptation as a human being. The incredible value of his life in this view is that he was fully capable of failing, yet remained completely sinless through perfect human obedience and absolute reliance on God.
And E stands for empowered. This brings us right back to our earlier discussion on deeds. The idea is that Jesus' miracles were performed not by his own intrinsic power, but because he was uniquely anointed and empowered by God's Spirit to carry them out.
Finally, we finish the acronym with L for limited. The framework points out that Unitarians take Jesus' claims of limited knowledge, like for instance saying he doesn't know the day or the hour of his return, at total face value. They don't attribute this limitation to a separate human nature, while some divine nature secretly knows everything. Rather, it's accepted as a genuine limitation of the one unified person of Jesus. Section 5. The implications of agency and why this matters.
So the crucial point is, why does this specific structural debate actually change how adherents view the text? Well, for the sources presenting this critique, it fundamentally shifts the narrative focus. It frames Jesus not as a second divine person putting on a human suit, but as humanity's most exalted, victorious representative. It's all about a flawlessly obedient human agent, perfectly mediating God's will and achieving ultimate victory on behalf of humanity.
Which leaves us with a really compelling thought to close out this explainer. If we look at the text through this specific lens, where Jesus' power is entirely delegated and his temptations are entirely genuine, how does that amplify the magnitude of his perfect human obedience? It's a fascinating structural question, and one that absolutely encourages all of us to dive deeper into the source texts themselves. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep exploring.